We would like to welcome you all to this second session of our J. Bonner Ritchie Peace Conference. We want to express our gratitude to all of you who are here today. Just a quick mention, this conference is sponsored by the UVU Peace and Justice Studies Program and co-sponsored with the UVU Center for the Study of Ethics and the Center for the Study of for Constitutional Studies. It is an effort to try to strengthen our ability to deal with others who differ from us and where there are strong disagreements between us. We had the opportunity to listen to our first presenter this morning, and we will now hear from Sarah Cook. Sarah currently resides in Northern Ireland. She has lived there for several years, has been very actively involved in efforts there to deal with the problems in Northern Ireland that go back for many, many years, but during the conflict between the Irish Protestants and the Irish Catholics, and the efforts there to bring those two groups together and to develop an understanding there. And then Sarah has worked beyond that particular endeavor and is currently working in several sites throughout the world, including in the South Pacific, where she's also working on efforts at using storytelling, especially in dialogue, in seeking reconciliation between parties that have been deeply divided. It's a privilege for us to have Sarah here. This is her fourth year coming to be with us here, and she has some very, very significant and worthwhile insights. And we'll have her present for 50 minutes to an hour, and then there will be time for you to ask questions or make comments about her presentation. So Sarah, thank you for coming. We appreciate it and look forward to what you have to say.
Thanks so much for that warm welcome, Lynn. And it's wonderful to be here. I always say this when I'm at UVU. I feel like UVU is sort of a home away from home. I've been working with the university in various ways almost for 20 years now. And so it's just a real pleasure to be with you. I'm always really impressed by the quality of the questions that students have and the engagement. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing your insights during our question and discussion time at the end. And I'm a talker, so I'm going to really try to keep to time. As Lynn mentioned, I live and work in Northern Ireland. He was very kind. The few years that I've been there is actually 24, so I've lived half my life in Northern Ireland and half my life in the United States. You can tell from my accent, which I've never lost. I'm originally from the U.S. So I'm gonna hold back on a lot of my work background, and I'll share some stories as we move through the presentation, which will give you hopefully a good sense of some of the insights from various pieces of work I've done over the years. But I will say that a lot of what we're going to talk today about really had its roots in my practice in Northern Ireland. Okay, so I'll say a little bit about that, and I'll also say a little bit about what I did in the States before I moved to Northern Ireland. So I graduated from an Indiana university, and I worked for 2 years before I moved abroad. And the work I did at that point was with young women who had been affected by rural poverty and who found themselves unexpectedly pregnant and experiencing homelessness. So we ran a facility where young women could come when they were pregnant, have their babies, have some support as they started to parent, and then find stable housing. And what was really interesting to me is I noticed a whole variety of stress and trauma-related symptomology in the young women that came to stay with us that was totally separate from their pregnancy. Okay, and the deep sort of embedded rural poverty they were experiencing. You may get a sense of this. We were 15 miles from the headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan, where we were based. base. So there was huge amounts of racism, huge amounts of trauma that people were carrying with them. And so I noticed this in the bodies, and that kind of, that sort of stayed with me as a young professional. Like, what do we do with this kind of level of trauma and stress? And then I moved to Northern Ireland. And the work I did in Northern Ireland was really with people who'd been affected by the conflict there, the 30-plus year conflict, but also people who were involved in it, okay? So our project was essentially designed initially to bring former British soldiers who had served in Northern Ireland back to Northern Ireland to engage in storytelling and dialogue with civilian populations. And doing that in the city of Derry, Londonderry, and some of you may know, if you know about the conflict in Northern Ireland, that's where Bloody Sunday took place. Incidentally, it's also where Derry Girls is based. And I know a lot of people love the television. Everyone's like, yes, Derry Girls. A lot of you have seen Derry Girls. And so you'll have seen even through the TV show, those of you who've seen it, that there was a real tension point between British state violence in Derry and the civilian impact. And that trauma still can really be felt in the city today. And so some people in Derry were saying, our community's been so supportive, our families have been so supportive after we've been bereaved maybe or injured by state violence, British soldier violence. But also we have questions, we have a need for healing that they can't satisfy. Only meeting with the perceived enemy, being able to be in dialogue, being able to hear their stories, what was it like for them, why did they join up, what was the motivation, how do they feel now after their service in Northern Ireland. And so basically what we had was this really beautiful, really complex storytelling and dialogue process, which expanded very quickly to include former British soldiers and their families, prison officers, where a lot of the conflict-related action took place in their families, police officers and their families, so all the state actors, Catholic paramilitaries and Protestant paramilitaries and their families, and then people who would have been injured or bereaved by state violence or paramilitary violence. And people were coming together to extremely courageously share their stories, talk about the impact they'd experienced, and also to listen and acknowledge, listen to and acknowledge the experiences of others, okay? And what I noticed, in addition to this tremendously kind of generous human spirit that was on display in these conversations, were the trauma responses. Again, they came up very, very significantly, these kind of stress and trauma responses that people were experiencing. So some people hadn't left their house in months or years. They were leaving their house literally for the first time to come to these encounter-based weekends. Some people were having nightmares. Some people were having flashbacks. Some people were dissociating on a regular basis, difficulties with relationships, heavily self-medicating with alcohol and drugs. And what was fascinating is many of the same stress and trauma responses I witnessed in these American young women who were pregnant and experiencing homelessness, and people 6,000 miles away from a Northern Ireland-based background were almost exactly the same. Okay, so as a practitioner, I'm a social worker by education, a historian and a social worker. So I know we've got some history folks in the room today. So naturally, I started thinking, what can we do to get tools into the hands of people who are doing courageous things in terms of their peace building, taking real risks for that, maybe doing really courageous inner healing work, maybe getting therapy or doing some other things to help explore their journey. But we're really being held back on a very practical level by these stress and trauma responses. And so that's what got me really interested in how do we as peace builders, as mediators, as negotiators, even as historians and teachers, how do we engage with the way that trauma really affects people who've been impacted by conflict and by historical violence and political unrest? So as you'll see, today's conversation is about that. How do we explore trauma-informed approaches to peace building, to storytelling, to dialogue work, to mediation, and how do we design our work and carry it out in a really trauma-responsive way? So today's going to be really practical, and I hope it's the start of a conversation. So I've included a fair amount of slides. I'm not going to speak to all of them in great detail, but you can have access to these after. And so really encourage you to kind of think about this as an awareness raising, kind of question generating time together for the next hour. And I hope you get a lot of practical insights and tools for your own toolbox, but I also hope this is the beginning of some deeper conversations that you might have amongst yourselves here at UVU. So what is trauma-informed peace building? Or we might think about it as what is trauma-informed mediation for those of us who are mediators. It's essentially peace building that takes into account the knowledge and the effects of trauma. So it's about building our understanding of what trauma is, that very basic level of psychoeducation. What does trauma and stress look like in the body? What causes it? What's the biology of it? So taking into account that knowledge, as we design processes of peace building, as we implement those processes, and as we follow up from those processes, which are that's a really important part of it, and we're going to talk about that later. So what this looks like essentially as we're thinking about these components is creating processes that are safer. I shouldn't say safe, I should say safer for people participating, whether that's a high-level negotiation between governments, whether that's a community mediation, or whether that's coming alongside of grassroots communities who've experienced conflict and trying to support them in their own peace-building processes. So how do we make it as safe as possible, knowing people are deeply affected by conflict? How do we remain responsive within those processes? So for a lot of us as practitioners, you might see some stuff playing out and think, ooh, that person is being affected by what is happening right now in the room. I can see that they're really responding in a pretty significant way. But as practitioners, we have not always known how to hold that or handle that. So a lot of people just keep going. You know, if you're in the middle of a mediation and someone's starting to really show signs of stress, you're like, I'm just going to keep mediating. Okay, so how can we change our practice to be able to have the confidence as practitioners to say, actually, let's respond in this moment? Not in a clinical or therapeutic way, because I'm not a therapist, but still I can support people in this in a very fundamental way to feel safer, to feel more balanced, to feel like they can focus again and be safer within themselves as they proceed through this process. So how do we respond to stress and trauma, kind of signs and symptoms that emerge within our processes? And how do we minimize re-traumatization? So as we design and carry out and follow up from our processes of peace building, dialogue, storytelling, how do we make sure that we're minimizing re-traumatization and how we do that? Okay, so today's conversation is going to be a little bit about all of these things. And why this is important for us to be aware of in our work is that people often, when they're experiencing stress and trauma response, which is really normal after they have gone through a conflict, whether that's a family-related conflict that's being mediated or whether that's a state-to-state conflict at the international level, people have these stress and trauma responses that come up in peace-building processes, but often they're scared and confused when these emerge and they don't quite know how to respond or know what's happening, okay? So as I mentioned, I used to work with a lot of British soldiers. I also worked with a lot of ex-combatants or former paramilitaries, and a lot of them had post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? So a lot of them would be experiencing PTSD. And we'd be in dialogues and people would be talking about their experiences of the conflict in Northern Ireland, and people would start to have a flashback. They'd be reliving that, a very difficult moment, very unexpectedly, of their own experience in Northern Ireland of combat. But a lot of people didn't understand what they were experiencing, and so they would just sit quietly and suffer from it, okay? So we want to be able to kind of support people who are having those stress and trauma responses in our processes. And one of the ways we can do this is just to help them understand what's happening. Hey, what you're experiencing right now is a flashback. It's really normal. Let me help you if you're open to that. I can support you in this moment to help you hopefully feel a little bit better. So we can help them feel safer or more in control of themselves and their responses in the moment by using well-being skills. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And what that results in is safer processes for participants who are engaged in storytelling or dialogue or mediation or other peace-building work. But it also allows us to be more effective in that work. Okay, because I've seen time and time again, whether it's a mediation or storytelling or dialogue, people get hijacked by their nervous systems, by their stress responses, and suddenly they're out of the game. Or suddenly you see somebody throw a big verbal grenade right into the middle of the dialogue because they're responding pretty strongly within themselves and they're trying to shut it down because they're like, I need out. So they say something really explosive, everything goes nuts, and then you're kind of like, okay, where do we go from here? So when we can help people feel safer within these processes, not only is it more responsible on our part as peace builders, but it also allows the processes themselves to unfold with more effectiveness this as we move through them. Now, I'm hoping that for those of you who are not thinking about becoming mediators or peace builders, you find what we talk about after this really interesting, because I think what I'm finding is that I'm doing a lot of work now in different parts of the world in different sectors, and nobody really has trauma-informed practice built into their educational experience. So I would love to hear from some of you at the question and answer period if you have had, kind of a basic psychoeducation on stress and trauma response in your education here at UVU, because no matter where I go in the world, whether it's teachers who would deal with a lot of trauma in the classroom now, doctors and nurses who I work with all the time, politicians, humanitarian workers, negotiators, all of us are front-facing to trauma in our occupations, and many of you will experience it in the work that you do when you leave UVU. And yet we're kind of flying blind. We don't really know what's happening. We don't know the basics around stress and trauma. So this is super important to many of us in many fields of work, because starting to just, not on a clinical level, we're not going to be counselors or therapists, but just starting to get a real sense of what's normal and natural when people have experienced trauma, what those reactions might be, can really help us in the work that we do to support people better. So let's talk very briefly about trauma itself, and for those of us who are involved in mediation and peace building work, where that kind of shows up. So I love the definition that Bezel van der Kolk has created around this, and some of you have probably heard of his book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's a fascinating read. I definitely recommend it. But what he defines trauma as is an inescapably stressful event that overwhelms people's existing coping mechanisms. Okay, and I love this definition. It's simple, it's to the point, but it also is quite strengths-based, and it gives that nod to the fact that we already have developed as people some really effective coping mechanisms, okay? We know how to get through everyday stress. We know how to manage our lives when they get really busy or overwhelming, but we know maybe that it's trauma when all of those coping mechanisms become overwhelmed, and we find that we're having that deeper impact within ourselves, that kind of more sustainable impact that often really starts to affect a lot of areas of our life and our functioning. What's important for us to know as peace builders and mediators, but for those of us who may not do that as well, is that trauma can be experienced collectively. Okay, so we often think of it as a very singular individual experience, but actually groups, communities, families, and nations can experience trauma as well. Okay, and understanding collective trauma can really help us to understand why people act as they do following war or political upheaval. And I've done a lot of work in Afghanistan, so I've got this picture, lovely picture of women from Afghanistan. And you think about countries like Afghanistan that have experienced conflict-related trauma for multiple generations now, and you kind of go, no wonder people respond in a certain way as a community or as a nation. And we're going to talk about that later when I share a case study with you. But it's also important to know that collective trauma can arise from things that are not conflict related, okay? So it can be collective adversity, whether that's from a community that's been marginalized or whether that's from a even broader collective of people like a nation. And one of the things I would argue, and that a lot of people are arguing, is that we might consider the impact of COVID-19 a collective trauma that many people around the world have experienced. And there are quite a few of us arguing for the fact that this last election, the 2024 election, was so hot because we were still reeling as a nation from the collective trauma of COVID. And we hadn't really acknowledged that or explored that. And so no matter what side of the political aisle you were on, it was a life or death election. Everyone was like, our nation is going to end no matter who gets elected. There was a lot of heated language. And it was so curious to some of us, that's a lot of emotion, a lot more emotion than most elections. And you could argue a lot of reasons for that. But some of us would say, could it have been this? People were still really impacted very deeply collectively by that experience of COVID-19. And that kind of collective trauma plays out in a lot of interesting ways. Another thing that can come up for us as peace builders, as mediators, is historical trauma. Okay, so I've kind of included a definition here: collective emotional and psychological injury over our lifespan, but also over the generations. And when you look at a nation like Ukraine and what they're experiencing now in the war, I've worked in Ukraine for the last 3 years, and one of the interesting things that we've really seen and heard is older members of the community that lived through World War II, that lived through a lot of the kind of the previous Russian incursions or impact in Ukraine, through some of the electricity outages in the 80s and 90s, through what could be considered a famine during a similar period of time, are finding that what's happening now with Russia's attacks on Ukraine actually is playing out for older people in a really multi-level way. So people are having real reminders, if not full-on flashbacks, of their previous experiences. So when we're doing support work, when we're doing trauma-informed work with people there, we're not only addressing some of the impact they're experiencing now because of the current war, but helping them recognize and address some of those other reactions that come up. And we see historical trauma, in nations that have experienced the impact of colonialism. We see that with communities and groups within nations that have experienced kind of abuse or misuse or mistreatment from the government. So we see historical trauma playing out over long, long periods of time in some pretty significant ways. And that shows up often within our peacebuilding processes. So really important for us to think about that if we're looking at negotiations between nations and regions or peacebuilding internally. I could do an entire day, by the way, on all of these slides. So please do ask some questions if you have them. I'm going to whip through this, but so many of us are really interested in intergenerational trauma. So I've given you some points here to look at if you're interested in studying this, for yourself. But intergenerational trauma, fascinatingly, comes from both nature and nurture. Okay, so for a lot of years we were like, does trauma that a younger person experiences, is that because of the way their parent was distracted or incapacitated by their own experience of trauma, so it affected the way they parented? And of course, the answer can be yes to that. But what we're also finding is that it's also nature. So trauma is physically passed down, or physically can be passed down to the following generations. So when we think about that and try to understand it, we do it through the lens of epigenetics. So that is the study of how environmental factors and experiences can cause changes in the way that genes are passed down to future generations. And it's not solely about intergenerational trauma, but we're using the field of epigenetics really to look at that. Okay, how does trauma play into that? And Rachel Yehuda, who comes from a family of Holocaust survivors, has done some really seminal work on this. And she comes to Belfast every year and does kind of a lecture on epigenetics and intergenerational trauma, because we're a conflict-affected society. And I always sit and type frantically for the entire hour that she's up. So if you're interested in looking into this more, I would highly recommend her work. But what her work shows, and the work of other people looking at this kind of intergenerational transmission of trauma, is that trauma exposure in the parent can result in epigenetic changes that affect the sperm and the egg. So basically, if one of your parents has experienced very deep trauma impact, you might have their gene contribution impacted. If both of your parents have experienced that, then that impact increases. Okay, or the likelihood of impact. Like schizophrenia and some other mental health experiences, it's important to say that just because the genes have been impacted by your parents' experience does not necessarily mean they'll turn on or activate. Okay, so some people whose parents have experienced trauma may not have those stronger trauma responses within themselves. So that's something to keep in mind, and environment impacts that hugely. So if you have questions about that, we can talk about that later. It's also important to know that the presence of that altered gene can give us some benefits as well, okay? So we have to remember the body is hardwired for survival. It's how we've been designed. It's how people function. And so when we have that intergenerational transmission of trauma, the body's just trying to help us respond better to protect ourselves, okay? So it's not, it's not anything nefarious. It's designed to help us survive and thrive over the years. So what we also get with intergenerational transmission of trauma is some good stuff. So people whose parents have both experienced trauma also show indicators of greater resilience within themselves, a quicker and more effective response to threat, which is really interesting, and more attunement to social justice issues and social change, which, I could share so many different examples, but we see that in so many trauma-affected populations throughout the world, okay? So really important to keep this in mind, okay? And I have some fascinating additional stuff on this that I might share in the Q&A if we've got the time for that, okay? I want to mention a couple of other things, and I'm going to move a little bit in these next few slides into how we need to look after ourselves as practitioners, okay? Whether you're a social worker, whether you're a teacher, whether you are a negotiator, a peace builder, it's really important to remember that if your work involves witnessing human suffering, you will be at risk of secondary or vicarious trauma. Okay, two names for the same thing, and what that actually means is just that impact, that personal psychosocial impact that we can experience within ourselves that comes from the prolonged exposure to the trauma of others. Okay. And this is related to compassion fatigue and burnout, but slightly different. So it's just about that exposure to trauma. And that can include witnessing people who are suffering. It can include hearing, reading, and writing stories of adversity. So I often work with researchers and big humanitarian organizations who are trying to, understand their practice, report on it, evaluate it. And they'll say to me, "Oh, I shouldn't be working with you because I don't work in the field the way my colleagues do." And yet they're experiencing deep impact. And what the research shows is when we witness, even through written form, the suffering of others, it impacts us almost as if we were in the kind of physical witnessing space, okay? So when I did my social work degree, I remember thinking, I don't know if I can do this. I'd be reading these horrific case studies and think, maybe I'm not cut out for this. Like I can really feel this in my body, even as I'm reading this for my university education. And then I got out in the field and discovered people are funny and they're resilient and they're living really amazing lives despite their impact. And we don't get that part in the case studies. So it's really important to remember, even for those of you students now, if you're kind of overwhelmed and thinking, can I do this? It's important to remember we see that multiplicity of people's, kind of life experiences when we're out in the field. So that's a little rabbit trail, as we'd say in Northern Ireland. I'll get back to the point. But it's important to know that if we're providing support to people who've experienced trauma, we will probably experience some sort of impact within ourselves. And I've included some of the symptoms of this up here. I'll let you look at those yourselves instead of going through them. But, all of these things can kind of come from other experiences in life or other kind of mental health impact. But it's important for us to notice if we have more than one of these start to crop up, it may be time to support ourselves, to gain some support, because secondary trauma is really normal. Okay, I experienced it absolutely when I was doing the storytelling work with people in Northern Ireland. And it's not always predictable. It wasn't the times when I thought these are the most intense stories, I'm really going to be impacted. Sometimes it was different times. So we don't always know why. Okay, but it's really important for us to know it's normal and to get that support when we need it. So practitioners who engage in peace building and mediation with people who've experienced adversity really are at particular risk of secondary trauma because we're hearing those stories, we're supporting people, we care very deeply. So I'll say on a personal note, I often feel very strong in the midst of peace building processes that involve trauma-based stories. But when I saw the cascade of impact from USAID being underfunded or defunded a number of weeks ago, I sat at my computer and cried for like an entire morning because colleagues were emailing in from Myanmar going, we can't get medical support, or from Ukraine or from Afghanistan or from Syria. So it was really hard to kind of, walk alongside of people and then see their lives deeply impacted. So it's really important for us to kind of keep this awareness of it and to build up resiliency tools and approaches that can really support us in doing that. I'll say one other thing about trauma in terms of practitioners and what we might experience before we sort of move on to the next phase of what we're going to talk about. And that's the concept of moral injury. Sometimes it's called moral trauma. And I talked about this a lot in my group of teachers yesterday. We did some workshops with teachers, some of us. And, this is kind of an important and a new area of our understanding of trauma. And I'll tell you why the teachers and I were talking about it in a moment. But moral injury basically means that personal impact that comes when we're unable to prevent something from happening that we think should not happen, or when we're asked to do something that's against our moral code. Okay, so basically when our work in particular, but anything that we're a part of essentially goes against our deep beliefs about what should happen in society or what should happen in our line of work. Okay, many peace builders experience this, humanitarian workers, first responders, because they can never do enough. Okay, I'll give you an example. I was working with humanitarian response teams in Hungary, in Budapest, that were supporting the kind of resettlement of Ukrainian refugees. And one guy was so sweet. He was a 23-year-old translator, and he said, he said, I think I'm experiencing secondary trauma because I'm working like 18, 20-hour days. And I said, why are you working 18 or 20-hour days? And he said, well, because with the system that Hungary's set up, if I don't help translate because his role is as a translator, if I don't help translate for Ukrainian families who've literally come into the country on that day, they won't have a place to sleep and they won't get food vouchers. And I can't stand to watch families with kids sleep rough because they don't have anyone to translate to the government officials that will help them get these resources. And this poor guy was working all these hours hearing these horrific stories. And for him, it was that notion of, I need to do more. I can't do enough. People shouldn't sleep rough who are living through an experience of war. So him not being able to meet that need was a deep impact for him. We're seeing the same in Northern Ireland because of the kind of underfunding of the National Health Service. And I'm working with doctors and nurses who say, 5 years ago, we could have saved someone's life, but because the government has chosen very specifically to underfund the National Health Service, we don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough beds, and we can't get people testing as soon as they need it, and they're dying on our watch. And that's affecting us very deeply. So I want to just say to us, we can't always do enough in the work that we do, particularly within peacebuilding, okay? But other careers that some of you will be involved in. And so it's really important for us to remember some events are out of our control and help ourselves know how to hold these spaces for ourselves, okay? And what can help us to do that on a very basic level is remembering what else is true, okay? And this is important for us to think about more generally, working with populations that have experienced trauma or conflict. That is true. We don't pretend it's not. We want to recognize that. We're not gonna skate over the fact that people have been deeply impacted. But also, what else is true? What are those other factors in our lives that keep us going, that help us feel stronger, more resilient, that we often lose sight of when we're overwhelmed by trauma, okay? So if you're in a position in your work now or later in your life where you think, oh, I can't do enough, or I'm being prevented from doing something I think is really important actually in my work, remember to ask yourself that question, to give yourself space to go, that's true, and I want to feel that, but also, what are those things in my work that I am achieving that are important to keep in mind, okay? So it's important to say, I want to talk a little bit about some of the practicalities of this, just briefly for your own knowledge and information. It's important to say that when we experience any type of stress, even for those of you who are trying to juggle work and trying to get, major projects or papers in, trying to kind of do life while studying and working, even everyday stress can cause a constellation of impact in our lives, okay? And certainly trauma can as well. And so we often see that we're affected by in multiple areas of our lives when we experience stress or trauma. And I'm just going to pop these up. I'm not going to speak too much to them, but I'll let you take a look at them as I share a little bit more. So one of the things I always do is share this list, and you can see it's nowhere near exhaustive. We could add so many things to it, but when I work with groups, I virtually always share this, no matter what the circumstances are, because what it does is it helps people normalize what some of these responses are. Okay, and particularly when I'm working with men from more traditional societies, it's amazing to see the visceral body language change that happens when people look at this, because often people have spent years of their life feeling, kind of mentally weak, or like they're the only person who's experiencing this. And when they recognize and hear from me, this is all really normal. These are all very, very normal biological responses to an experience of stress or trauma. You literally see people go, and if I had $1 for every time people said, oh, I just thought I was crazy, I would be a very, very rich woman. So there's huge healing that comes from sometimes people just recognizing, actually, this is normal. If I'm experiencing, kind of sort of arguments at home or like disruptions in my relationships, if I can't sleep, if I'm noticing my digestion changing, if I can't remember things, like I'm trying to remember things and I realize I'm putting Post-it notes to myself everywhere, that's all very normal, okay? But for peace builders and mediators and practitioners in related fields, it's really important for us to know a little bit of these things, because you'll see, I'm only going to kind of go into one of these, but you see one of the mental impacts of stress or trauma is paranoia. okay? People feel like if they've experienced significant adversity, that the world is out to get them or other people are out to get them. And that's really normal, but we don't talk about that. So if you're mediating a conflict, it's going to be really normal for people to be paranoid. Or if you're working with governments or with people who've been affected by conflict at the grassroots level, that's really normal. We can anticipate that. People are going to have probably very irrational thoughts about what the other party is intending for them. Okay. And I've been there myself. I experienced that and thought, why am I reacting this way? I'm a very optimistic person. I believe in people and blah, blah, blah. And thought, why am I suddenly suspicious of everybody around me? Not realizing it was a stress or trauma response. So really important for us to educate ourselves and the people we're working with on this. And also to remind people not only are they normal, but these things will pass. Okay? In time, we know that these things change and pass, or the volume turns down on them. The intensity reduces. And we can use what I'm going to mention in just a moment, some well-being tools to help manage that for ourselves, but really important to know that it's normal. I'm not going to go into the detail of all of this, but I want to touch extremely briefly on the nervous system and brain because there's a very practical physiology to why stress and trauma can inhibit our processes of storytelling, dialogue, mediation, and other types of peace-building work. As we know, the body's designed for survival, and the nervous system is one of the parts of that really helps us. So the nervous system is designed to work quicker than the brain and to really move us within a split second into a pretty strong survival response to keep us alive, okay? So we can move into fight, flight, or freeze extremely quickly when our sympathetic nervous system gets us ready for action. So you can think about that like the accelerator of a car, okay? And we see this all the time in peace-building processes where people will, as they're talking about an experience, find that the body goes, ooh, are we in danger? Are we on high alert? Let's act. So that might come out as real aggression if somebody kind of goes into kind of fight mode. It may not be physical fights, though it can be. But, sometimes we see people get really aggressive and they may not know that. I remember working with a man who lost a number of his family members in the Northern Ireland conflict. And he was quite unpleasant to work with, okay? This is being live streamed, so I need to be really careful about what I say. But, people would be like, do we have to invite him to our victims conferences? And, it's really hard to work with him. And he and I had a really interesting conversation about that one day. Why do people avoid me? And it was really hard to kind of find a way to say, well, you seem really aggressive, but I don't think you realize that, so he was moving into fight without that knowledge. Or we see flight. I work with teachers in Northern Ireland and help them understand the experiences of kids seeking asylum or refuge in Northern Ireland from war zones. And often the kids are like this in their seats and they're hopping up and they're hopping down and the teachers are like, why can't they hold still? And I'm like, well, they've got flight energy going on in the body. Something has reminded them of something that felt really unsafe to them. And they're literally like this. Or we might see freeze. You might be in the middle of mediation and suddenly one of the parties who's been really engaged just stops talking and they're not saying anything and they're sort of shutting down. They may be in a freeze response. So understanding those basic responses is important, but also just knowing what's happening in the body, even in a tough conversation. We have all had this since the election, okay, or during the election, where you're in a conversation with somebody in your family probably who has a very different political perspective than you, and they're sharing their thoughts on what's going on. And suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, I'm hot, and my heart's racing, and my stomach's tight, and I'm sweating, I'm shaking because I'm really... And this is what happens in the body when we have those hard conversations. So it's really normal, even if we don't move into full fight, or freeze mode, that we're noticing that in the body. What's important for us to know is we can assist our processes of mediation and peace building by helping people do what the body does naturally. So the body is always going to calm us down. That parasympathetic nervous system is always going to come into play eventually, bring us back into that beautiful state of balance. But we can do it for ourselves. Okay? And when we teach people biological self-regulation tools, it means if they get stuck in the middle of a mediation, if the other party goes, I totally think you're wrong and you're lying, and the person's like, I am not lying, and their body starts to wind them up, their sympathetic nervous system goes on and that accelerator goes down, they can put the brake of their nervous system on for themselves. They can recognize, I'm losing control here. Let me just use something that will help me regulate my nervous system. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Also, we want to attend to the brain because a lot of people in mediations and negotiations, storytelling processes, dialogue processes are hijacked by kind of their brain response. And I'm not going to say too much. Again, we could spend the whole rest of our time talking about the brain, but there are 3 different networks of the brain. The brain's a very complex network of networks, but the survival network is the part that governs fight, flight, or freeze. So it's what kicks that into action. And this is also the part of the brain that manages, things like breathing. Thankfully, we don't have to think about breathing. We don't have to think about digesting. This lovely survival network does that for us subconsciously. But remember, this is a subconscious part of the brain, okay? So we cannot self-talk to this part of the brain because it only responds to sensation. So it responds to, do you feel safe or do you feel in danger in this moment? And if we're in the midst of a very difficult dialogue, and we start getting activated in our body, this part of the brain goes, all right, let's move into fight or flight, or freeze. Let's really keep that going. But if we feel safer, if we can feel calmer, we can signal to this part of the brain to go, oh, it's okay. Let's bring everything back into balance. Okay? This is very complex neuroscience that we're doing in about 2 minutes. So if you have questions, you can ask at the end. But we also know that there's a fire alarm part of the brain, the limbic system, which houses the amygdala. Some of us have heard of this, the emotional network of the brain. And this is the part of the brain that rings the fire alarm, sounds the alarm if it thinks that something that we're experiencing is dangerous or threatening to us. And then we have our beautiful prefrontal cortex, our thinking network of the brain, that does all of what we generally think of when we think of brain function. Sifts through facts, helps us make decisions, helps us engage in language, helps us to think strategically and logically. What we need to know as practitioners, no matter what you're doing, whether you're a teacher or whether you are a negotiator or mediator or peace builder, is that when our limbic area, when our emotional network starts to sound that fire alarm, goes, we're in danger, it sends the prefrontal cortex, the thinking network, offline, okay? Because it takes too long. We don't want to be like, should I do this? Should I do this? What'll happen if I do this? If a bear is in front of our path, okay? We've got to act much more quickly than that. So what it does is it sends this very slow thinking brain offline, and it gives all of the control to the survival network. So then we're running on those survival instincts. So what's important for us to think about when we're kind of hosting or facilitating a storytelling space with people who've been affected by conflict or trauma, or we're working through a really complex and difficult political dialogue, or whether we're mediating or doing other types of peace building work, people will find that their prefrontal cortex disengages, okay? And then it's really hard for them to think strategically or creatively together. They can lose their train of thought. They can totally disengage from the dialogue. So what we need to start helping people do is find ways to really feel calmer and to send those signals to their survival brain that they're okay, so that they can keep that prefrontal cortex online or bring it back when it's gone, so they can be fully present in our processes of peace building. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So finally, I want to share, before we move on, why we respond to other people, why we are hardwired for empathy. We know this as people. We share emotions. We talk about stress being contagious or trauma being contagious. And there are a couple of biological reasons for this. So the first is mirror neurons. Okay, so these are parts of our brain cells that are specifically designed to help us reflect and experience what other people are feeling. Okay, so if you're at coffee with a friend and they're like, I've just won $1 million, they're going to be very excited. And if you were both wired up to brain scanners, the part of their brain that would be flashing, going, woo, this is exciting, would start to flash in your brain too. Now, they've not promised you any of that money, but you would have that same feeling of excitement, of joy within yourself, okay? So we're designed to share each other's emotional experiences and to reflect each other's states of being. But our nervous systems are also in communication with each other. So this is called nervous system resonance. So we're attuned to each other. Okay, so if you are a part of a mediation, I hope none of you ever have to be, but if you're a part of a mediation where you hire a mediator and you sit down to be mediated, and Ray's going to talk to us about this in her conversation, but if your mediator is like, ooh, like really nervous and really excited and really hyped up because they've had a really stressful morning, as soon as you sit down at that table, it's really likely that your body's going to do the same thing, because your nervous system's going to sense that theirs is 0 to 60, their accelerator's down, and your body's going to do the same thing. And everyone around the table will probably have that experience. Okay, so we literally communicate with each other. And we even have that physiological mirroring, okay? And I'll tell you a story about this, where our physical conditions respond to those around us. I was working on the border of Turkey and Syria, after the earthquakes. And I was working with a team of humanitarian workers who very sadly were supporting people who had been impacted by the earthquakes but had lost family members of their own. Okay. So one of the people we were working with lost 20 members of his family because they were all in the same apartment building that collapsed. And so as you can imagine, it was an intense environment already. And my co-trainer was Ukrainian. And she had checked her messages at the break and had discovered that the Russians had bombed the dam. So some of us remember that a year and a half ago. So the dam was, flooding all of these towns. So she came up to me in the break and she's like, this just happened. I'm really feeling it in my body. And I said, do you want me to teach the next section? Like, why don't you go and just look after yourself, take a break? And she said no, because the next section was going to be us doing a demo of resiliency skills. And she's like, I need to feel these in my body right now. And so I said, okay, let's do it. So we sat down together. She was already seated and I was turning my chair towards hers so that I could we could do this demo in a really, connected way. And all of a sudden my heart started racing and I couldn't breathe. Okay. And I was like, whoa, what's just happened there? Pretty dramatic shift. And she said to me when we started the demo, I'm so sorry, but I can barely sit here because my heart's racing so badly and I can't breathe. And I was like, bingo. Okay. And so what we did is we used some resiliency tools together and regulated both of our nervous systems, which meant that we both could feel that relief in our body at the same time. So this is really important for us to remember, no matter what our profession, the people we're working with we're going to experience what they're experiencing within themselves, emotionally, physiologically, particularly in the body. And so it's really important for us to remember and to know a little bit about how to regulate our own nervous systems, keep our kind of thinking networks, our prefrontal cortex is online, and how to do that for the people around the table. Because if we can be, in a pretty balanced state together, we're going to be able to think more creatively, more expansively, and feel better in our bodies as we move through the processes of peace building that we're working on. I'm not going to say too much about this, but I want to give you a little sneak peek into how we can actually do this. So what the research is showing is really clear that there's this kind of what we could call a triangle of well-being. Okay, there are 3 factors that help us feel better in our bodies and better emotionally when we're impacted by stress responses. The first are our thoughts. Okay, so you might be doing something really difficult and, you're kind of talking yourself through it and you're going, okay, this is going to be really hard, but I love what I'm doing. I believe in my work. Some of you might say this to yourselves as you're going through UVU. I really don't want to turn in this paper, but I believe in what I'm going to do once I graduate. I'm going to really think about that and draw strength from it. Okay. Our emotions can also be helpful. We can really feel love, we can feel gratitude, and those things can help us feel better when we're really struggling. But what science is showing us is sensations are the most important part of that triangle when we're really dysregulated or out of whack because of stress or trauma response. And sensations are quite simply the physical feelings or the physical experiences in the body. Is our heart racing? Is it steady? Is our breath really fast and, high the way my colleagues and mine were in Syria and Turkey? Or we just taking a lovely deep breath? Are our shoulders up because we're totally stressed? Or can I feel that tension coming out? Is my jaw looser? So simple. But why sensations are important is they're signaling to our survival brain and they're signaling to our nervous system that we're actually okay in this moment. There's no bear. Okay. And so science is showing us that anytime we pay attention to a sensation connected to well-being, it will start to regulate the nervous system. And the more we pay attention to those sensations, the more that well-being grows in the body. Super simple, but really transformative, because a lot of what we do for self-care as practitioners, we have to do outside of the situations we're working in. So whether when you graduate, you're a nurse or you're a teacher or you're a mediator or you're a peace builder, you can't just stop and take your dog for a walk in the middle of a hectic day. You can't be by the beach and watching the sunset or off skiing when you're in the middle of a really difficult conversation. But what we can do is we can work with our nervous systems in those moments by learning how to bring sensation into play or how to calm ourselves so that we can experience that balance in the body. Okay? You'll have to forgive me. I picked up a cold on the plane, so don't shake my hand after this is done. So the model that I most frequently use for this around the world is the community resiliency model. And it helps kind of explain stress and trauma from that biological perspective, which helps people move away from the kind of shame of that and the pathology of that to just give themselves a lot more grace, and to have some hope that that can change. And it does that by providing 6 wellness skills that help people immediately regulate the nervous system. Okay. And the research around this is really strong. You can look at, I'm going to share a website at the end where you can see the research, but statistically significant decreases in depression, hostility, anxiety, and somatic or physical symptoms of stress and trauma for the people who use it. So highly recommend looking into that. And it uses these different well-being tools to help create sensations of well-being in the body and to be more aware of those. But it's important to say anything that helps you can help you feel good in yourself, can help you create a sensation of well-being. So even just taking a moment to think about your last vacation or, a really lovely moment you've had with a friend or something that you love to do, happy memory, stopping and thinking about that and noticing what you experience in the body. Do I take a deeper breath? Does my stomach feel more relaxed? Simple things like that can start to signal to your brain and nervous system that you're okay in that moment. So really encourage you to start to play with that for yourself, find ways to kind of notice those sensations of well-being in your own body. And a free resource that can help you with this actually is the iChill app. So this is an app created by the Trauma Resource Institute that outlines those 6 skills and helps talk you through them. So you can get that on your phone or your desktop. So highly recommend that you look into that. And for those of you who may be practicing Peacebuilding or other work in different parts of the world, it's in Spanish, it's in Arabic, it's in Hebrew, it's in Ukrainian, and they're working on Japanese, I think. So lots of different language options when you're working in different parts of the world. So I want to start to kind of bring us towards the close by talking about, okay, now that we've talked a little bit about trauma, now that we've talked a little bit about what's going on in the body and understand that maybe a little bit more, now that we've talked about how we can practically regulate our bodies using well-being skills or by, kind of working with the nervous system and helping to balance it. I want to talk a little bit about how we actually do trauma-informed and resiliency-focused peace building. So how do we start to bring all this together in our practice? The first thing to say is it can be really helpful for us to be a little bit more aware of the psychosocial needs of people affected by conflict, okay? And that can be conflict within families or communities. That can be conflict at the national or international level. But what's really important for people, and I see this time and time again, is what I've addressed already, the psychoeducation and the normalization. And by psychoeducation, I literally mean just teaching people what we've just talked about. This is what's normal for you when you've experienced trauma. Because that normalizes it for people. And people already, for many people, start healing a little bit by just going, yeah, okay, I'm a human being. I am humaning in this moment when I'm really feeling overwhelmed by the difficult experiences I've experienced in my life. But we also need to help people understand how to manage those somatic or those physical reactions to stress and trauma. So giving people that education, that empowerment to say, we're not prisoners of our nervous systems. We're not prisoners of our stress responses. We can bring our nervous systems into balance, and this is how we do it. And I've worked with so many people affected by conflict and trauma around the world, and it is so empowering because trauma takes away our sense of agency, conflict takes away our sense of empowerment, and so people often can't control any of what's happening around them. Think about people in Ukraine right now, like 3 years of war. They can't control any of that. They've got Russia making decisions. They've got America making decisions. They have no input into who's calling the shots and what's happening. But they can start to control what's happening in their bodies, okay? And one of my colleagues in Ukraine said, I used to be in bed for 3 days every time we got bad news in the war, okay? Her husband's at the front right now. And she's like, I would be incapacitated and I have children to raise, but I just couldn't get out of bed. But once I started working with balancing my nervous system, I can't control what news is coming through, but I can control how I respond. So I may still feel low for a while, still kind of experience a bit of freeze response in my body, but I can function. I'm not in bed for days at a time. Okay. So this can be really hopeful and helpful for people on a practical level. And certainly people are coming into pretty high level peace building or kind of dialogue experiences can be really helpful for them to know how to do that within those spaces. We also can create a shared language, okay, within our families, within our communities, within the groups that we're working with, where people can kind of go, yeah, okay, we know what's happening, we can name it, and we know the techniques to manage it. And that can be really helpful to our processes. And we want to empower people to share what they know with others so that can expand. So, reminding ourselves that trauma-informed mediation and peace building involves integrating all of this knowledge into the way we design our processes, the way we implement them, and the way we follow up. But I also want to remind us, or to speak very quickly to what's resiliency-informed peace building, okay? So when I work around the world, I always want to highlight the trauma-informed parts of what we do, but also the resiliency-focused parts of what we do, both sides of that same coin. So resiliency-informed peace building and mediation are processes that integrate resilience tools and practices into the processes at all stages. So when you're prepping the parties for a significant dialogue or storytelling experience, letting them know you may experience, in fact, you probably will experience stress response, even no matter how much you believe in the work. So know that this is normal and know what you can do about it. And you can call on me as your facilitator, your mediator, to support you if you need that. Or you can call a timeout if you need a little bit of space to reset before we keep going. So prepping people with it, reminding people during the process, utilizing strengths-based questions and approaches to help people feel better and more resilient during the processes, and then helping to make meaning that way at the end. Really helping people not only walk away and go, yeah, we're done with that dialogue, that's great, but going, okay, what are we proud of in that? Where was the strength that showed up during that? How can we build on that individually and within our communities to really start developing that more? Resiliency-focused approaches also recognize that parties are resilient within themselves inherently and that their experience of conflict and trauma does not define them. Okay? We often, even as peace builders and mediators, go into our processes with a deficit-based approach. We're focusing on all the ways people have been hurt, traumatized, all the problems we have to work through. We forget to recognize people are inherently resilient and strong, and to utilize that within our processes to help people feel stronger and to help them lean into some of the strengths-based aspects of the way they can work together in our processes and after, in a best case scenario. But we also believe that resiliency-informed mediation and peace building, that our process inherently can be empowering for the parties. So it's not just about getting to that end goal. It's saying, how can we actually carry out our processes of peace building and mediation so that people feel better because they've been a part of it. Okay. I was working, don't have time to go too much into this story, but a big group of people, 24 people. I was mediating this massive group by myself. And it was a group of victims and survivors in Northern Ireland and an organization that had really hurt them unintentionally. And what I said to them was, all the way through this process, this is amazing because most peace-building organizations in Northern Ireland don't do internal peace-building work. They'll do it for other people, but if they have conflict, they just kind of pretend it's not there. And this organization was spending a lot of time and money to design or allow me to design a really impactful process and to do it together. It was very hard. It was very emotionally taxing. It was very risky for each person who was a part of it. And yet they did it. So even before we started, I was like, can I just say on day one, it's amazing you're actually doing this. You're doing something totally different than 98% of peace-building organizations in Northern Ireland. And you could literally see the body language change. People were like, yeah, we are. Okay. And that strength started to move in, and the openness started to move into the mediation very, very quickly. Okay. So how do we design both trauma-informed and resiliency-informed or resiliency-focused processes? So we need to just keep in mind, this is a little overview as we start to bring this to a close, that trauma can be both individual and collective, and it can show up in our peace-building processes in both of those ways. Okay, so we need to keep an eye out for that. We need to educate the parties or the participants and build their sense of agency. You don't have to be captured by what will happen in your body during this process. You can do something about it. I can help you. We're going to do this together. We want to anticipate potential triggers and create support structures within the processes as things get tough. We want to design breaks. We want to allow people to call for breaks. We want to create holding spaces in the way that we're talking and dialoguing in the midst of our processes when things are a little tougher. So we want to build in holding spaces within those. And we need to recognize as practitioners that we're all impacted by our work, and we need to plan ways to support ourselves before, during, and after the work that we do. So this approach is really important because, most people who enter into peace building or dialogue processes will have experienced trauma, So even with neighbor-to-neighbor disputes, when I was working in Belfast with people who were in fights with their neighbors because of dogs or noise levels or like shrubs that had gotten too high, like people would come in and their health and their mental health were so impacted by these conflicts. So we need to remember that this is going to be a normal part of conflict. And in the past, we've designed our processes to be like, let's get to the end and let's succeed. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we need to reframe this for ourselves to know that the processes are just as important as the outcome, okay? And that they're much more likely to be successful if people can remain calm and in control and focused throughout our time together, okay? Also, when we engage in trauma-informed work, it means that our processes are not only more effective, but we emerge from them less likely to be impacted by secondary trauma as practitioners. So something to keep in mind. We are coming to the end of our time. I'm going to give you guys time for questions instead of talking at you through the end of my slide presentation. But I'm going to include this one just for your own knowledge, okay? You'll all have access to this slide presentation once you're done. I've used what many people argue are the 6 fundamental principles of trauma-informed practice, no matter what field you're in, what area of work, and I've applied them to mediation and peace building. So you can have a little look at those on your own after this time. So I want to end with a very kind of hopeful case study, okay? So I've been working in Afghanistan since the rise of the Taliban, either with people who are part of the diaspora community now who fled because it's not safe, primarily women who were judges or professors or police women, kind of high up in Afghan leadership, to try to help people gain some skills and some knowledge in the areas we're talking about. And so I worked initially with 18 women online in a kind of psychosocial support group from all over the world. They were all living in different countries after the diaspora. And you can see here, I've included some of this. Women were describing an inability to sleep, having nightmares, intrusive thoughts and memories that they couldn't put aside, weight gain or loss, a sense of hypervigilance all the time, a reluctance to be alone, persistent crying, forgetfulness, feelings of physical heaviness, etc. And what happened after some psychosocial support, some information about trauma and stress, some support with using resiliency tools or self-regulation tools, is that women came away from, it was very simple, it was an 8-week process, it was not long, we met once a week for 8 weeks. People reported feeling stronger, calmer, less alone, lighter, and more ready for the future. Okay, and I've worked with over 200 people in Afghanistan over the last 3 years, and people will all say, this work has changed my life and my practice fundamentally. And then very briefly, just before Christmas, actually, I finished a piece of work that was several months in length around teaching negotiation and mediation skills for humanitarian workers in Afghan organizations that are working below the radar, because they could all be shut down if the government knew, to support women in Afghan society, okay? And we taught 24 professionals, women and men, basic kind of regulation skills, trauma-informed practice as part of that, so they could use this in their mediation and negotiation skills. And people said, I've learned so much about trauma and how to manage that in our life. We'll apply this to what I'm doing, et cetera. You can read the other quote yourself. But people said, this is really changing what we do, because everybody we're working with is traumatized, whether they articulate that or not. And so people saying just understanding that a little bit more has been fundamental for us individually and for the work that we do. So finally, as I bring this to a close, I want to leave you with the idea of post-traumatic growth. So Tedeschi has been a key researcher on this. He's got a lot of really interesting work that he and his colleagues have done. But what their research has shown is that as many as 90% of victims or survivors of significant trauma have at least one indicator of post-traumatic growth, okay? And what's really important to us in our practice is creating those holding spaces where people can recognize their own strengths, okay? People do not look for post-traumatic growth on our own. We often miss it in our own lives. And so encourage you to look at it for yourself and in the groups you're working with. So if you want to learn a little bit more about some of what I've been talking about, you can go to this website. This is perfect timing. My voice is giving out on me. The Trauma Resource Institute, they've got some great research and some great resources. And then I'll also share my email address in case people want to follow up. So that's us done and dusted, as we say in Northern Ireland. So let's move to questions and feedback from yourselves.
We have microphones so that you can speak into the microphone and being heard. Raise your hand if you have comments or questions, and we'll get the mic to you.
We've got simultaneous capturing of the microphones. Yes,
On
please
the
go ahead.
intergenerational trauma,
Yeah.
my question is how many generations does that last, and does it lesser through the generations?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So we're still really developing the research around that, but I'll share a very interesting study with you. So they wanted to look at this in mice, and mice love cherries. So I don't know if people know this. And so what they decided to do was to create, kind of pump cherry blossom scent into, the mice's cage and shock them very sadly as they pumped this cherry blossom scent in. And what they saw very, very quickly was that mice would move away very quickly. They would show really strong stress response, like nervous system activation, when they smelled cherry blossoms. And that happened quite quickly with this first generation of mice. But what happened then after is the baby mice, their children, and their grandchildren all showed the exact same stress response and aversion to cherry blossom smell, even though they had never been exposed to it or had never eaten cherries. Okay, so that first exposure to cherry blossom smell, there was like this full-on reaction. So they were starting to see that throughout multiple generations, so at least to kind of 2 to 3 generations after. But what was really interesting is they saw a couple things. They saw that there were more neurons related to smell that developed in subsequent generations of mice, remembering the body's trying to look after us, help us respond even more quickly. So their brains rewired to allow them to be more attuned to the smell to avoid the shock. But what's really hopeful and helpful in terms of your question is they also then, for some of these multiple generations of mice who had this cherry blossom fear and aversion, they would expose them to more nurturing activities. So instead of separating the moms and the babies earlier, they would keep them together, and they would give them nice food, and they would make sure the cages were warm. And for baby mice in these multiple generations after the impact, when they were cared for and nurtured and supported in really significant ways, their aversion and their fear response to cherry blossom smell stopped, okay? And then in their offspring, it wasn't present. So we're seeing some really good news signs that we can moderate some of those stronger impacts from intergenerational trauma by how people are nurtured and supported in life.
Yeah. We talked a lot about professionals and how they do peace building and mediation and help to calm themselves and other people down.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips specifically for a non-professional setting? Maybe when you're with a family member and you notice that they're starting to have these responses.
Yeah. Well, I think this is applicable across every area of life. And I often do trauma-informed mediation training. I work with humanitarian teams. I work with peace builders and negotiators. I work with conflict-affected communities. And, usually what we covered today is like a 2 to 3 day training. But what people always say when I check in with them after is my life has changed on a personal level. I'm using this for work, but actually my experience, personally and within my family is changing massively because I'm learning how to utilize this for myself. And so what I would say is, even if you don't think you're going to be going into a profession that's front-facing to trauma, it's wonderful to start getting curious about kind of your own nervous system, your own stress responses, and ways to manage that. So again, we've just just done a little kind of quick introduction to that today, but really encourage you to do that because our world is more challenging. And I think even outside of these kind of, spheres of mediation and peace building, I think as Americans, we need to be engaging in healing conversations and or difficult dialogue within our families, within our communities in very significant ways. And we can't do that if we're so deeply affected physiologically by it that we can't be present in those spaces. Okay. So I even noticed this. I was in Texas before I came here, and the Texans are all about the political conversations at the moment. And I do this for a living, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can feel this in my body. Like, and I can feel my thinking brain going offline because I'm like, well, let me tell you. So what's really important for us is to kind of really know how to be present in these spaces, particularly at this unique and significant time in our nation's history, no matter which part of the political aisle we're on. Because we want to be able to think clearly. We want to be able to ask ourselves critical questions. We want to be able to be present to the people we love who have differences from us in a really calm way. And you might even be noticing in your nervous systems and your bodies, when I was like acting that out a second ago, I could feel the physiological change for myself, and you probably could for you as well. But now that I'm experiencing that own change in my body, my nervous system, you're probably experiencing the same. So when we're going into those conversations, we need to give ourselves and others the gift of being able to stay calm and regulated, and really to be able to think critically and expansively around what we need in our country right now and in our communities right now. Deepening those divisions by losing control with each other is not going to change anything, okay? But we can fundamentally start to change those conversations when we can work on ourselves first and come into those spaces in a different way.
So just to see if I was understanding, we can learn things for ourselves about how our bodies work and how we react, and then carry that forward and act on that with ourselves in our spheres of influence.
Absolutely. And it is, it really does change your life. I totally outside of my work, when I started practicing these things for myself, it changed my relationship with my husband, with my kids. It changed the way we work together as a family, and really, kind of changed my experience of life. So I'd highly recommend that people start to explore that a little bit for yourselves. And if any of you have questions or want more resources about that afterwards, please don't hesitate to come up and pick my brain. I'd be happy to share that with you. It's a great question. Thank you so much for that.
We have time for one more question if you have one.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, because you mentioned other modern conflicts like Ukraine, and you say you work in Afghanistan. I just wanted to know if the ongoing Palestinian genocide has challenged or even reinforced any of the frameworks that mediators use to approach different kinds of trauma and the healing processes that accompany them, especially when it comes to Palestinian children and how they have grown up under constant state-sanctioned violence by the Israeli apartheid government.
It's an excellent question. And I think, probably the simplest way to answer that is that Gaza is redefining the meaning of trauma. Okay. So trauma experts around the world are saying everything we were using before, it's all kind of blown up because, that level of trauma, particularly that kids are experiencing, is off the charts. So I think irrespective of how you feel about, which side of that political aisle you're on in terms of Gaza, there's no way that you can't look at that and go, the loss of 50,000 people and the kind of wide scale destruction of of infrastructure isn't going to impact. Okay. And so I think it's not the answer I'd love to give you, but I think what we're seeing is that no one will know how to respond until we know how to respond. Okay. And there's not the resources or the ability to really work in that situation now while there's so much in flux. Okay, so people are working with refugees who are in different spaces, but for people who are still in Gaza, and in a similar way for people in the West Bank, most of whom have relatives in Gaza, it's just there's no space where that's practically available now to work with people on the level that they need that support. And so I think that's going to be something that's really important for us to think about, as America, we have skin in the game. A lot of our money is going into that part of the world right now. And so I think for those of us that care about peace building and trauma response and conflict response, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done there, and a huge amount of investment that comes, like, if we're part of the conflict, we need to be part of the conflict response. And it's important to say I've worked in Israel and in Palestine with Israelis and with Palestinians, and there's deep, deep, deep trauma historically and intergenerationally in both of those communities and populations. And so, as we'd say in Northern Ireland, there's a big job of work to be done, and I think we need to think really critically about how to act in the region more broadly.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and then at 1 o'clock, Ritchie will be presenting on the topic of the roles of identity in healing conversations. So it's sort of a natural step from what we've just been listening to. Also, as a kind of enticement, if you're so inclined, we do have pizza for the next session and soda. So those of you who happen to stay, there will be lunch, free food. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it.